Now, during World War II, there were many concentration camps which were liberated by the Allied soldiers, and inside of them were many harrowing sights. All across Germany and other occupied countries, there were emaciated prisoners who told of their plight and suffering at the hands of guards. The liberators quickly learned about the gas chambers and the crematories at sites which had been set up to mass murder and exterminate on a huge scale. Inside one of these camps, Ohrdruf, the site was liberated by the Americans, and Supreme Allied Commander Eisenhower and also General Patton came to visit as they couldn't believe what they were hearing which was found. Bodies were lying literally everywhere over the camp, and prisoners gave them a guided tour and demonstration as to what happened in the camp. But also found were a number of gallows which had been used inside of the camp for executions, but these in particular were brutal. Today we look at specifically the gallows of Ohrdruf, and to support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. Ohrdruf Concentration Camp was created in November 1944, and it was where around 20,000 people would be held. There were no beds, and prisoners were forced to sleep in blood-covered straw, and there was a huge amount of hard labour imposed daily upon the prisoners. They had to work sometimes very long 14-hour days, building railways, roads and tunnels, and they were given little to no food, and many suffered. There wasn't a gas chamber at this site. Presumably the inmates were to be exterminated through labour, but there were many execution methods used around the camp. As the American soldiers advanced towards Ohrdruf, the SS began to force march the prisoners to different sites, and it's believed that the SS, Volkssturm and Hitler Youth executed around 1,000 people during these specific death marches. The mass graves relating to this crime were later reopened, and the SS tried to burn the corpses right under the noses of the Americans. The SS guards also killed many of the prisoners who remained in the camp, luring them to the parade ground, saying they were to be fed, but the SS then shot them. When the Allies arrived at the camp, they were horrified by what they saw, and there were a few prisoners who had managed to hide out and survive. General George Marshall, the head of the Joint Chief of Staff, made a trip to see what happened at the camp, and he said, "The things I saw beg a description. While I was touring the camp, I encountered 3 men who had been inmates, and by one ruse or another had made their escape. I interviewed them through an interpreter. The visual evidence and verbal testimony of starvation, cruelty and bestiality was so overpowering as to make me a bit sick. In one room, where they were piled upon 20 or 30 naked men killed by starvation, George Patton would not even enter. He said that he would get sick if he did so. I made the visit deliberately, in order to be in a position to give first-hand evidence of these things if ever, in the future, there develops a tendency to charge these allegations merely to propaganda." General Eisenhower, as well as General Patton and Bradley, visited too, and they were horrified by what they saw. Some of the prisoners showed them around, and there was a structure that they stopped around for some time and discussed what happened on it. Inside of the camp were a number of gallows structures that had been left. These were found in the open parade grounds, and they were used in public executions by the SS guards. They were wooden, and there was a crossbeam held up by 2 uprights, and were probably around 12 feet high, and from the crossbeam was a hook or loop that someone could be hanged from. There was also a bench where the condemned would be stood upon, and this was probably around 2 to 3 feet off the ground. The point of this bench was so that at roll call, when the whole prisoner population was counted and checked, the hangings on these gallows would take place. The prisoners would be forced to witness the executions, and the platform or bench allowed everyone to have a good view of the execution. The SS intended to carry out these public executions so that the prisoners would be deterred from committing crimes, and the point of the executions was to scare and terrorise the people so they would be kept in line. There were many of these gallows found all over Ohrdruf, showing that the SS executed many people, often en masse at one time, and it wasn't just one structure that was used. Probably the prisoners were ordered to create the structures too, building them themselves. It was slow strangulation that the inmates suffered upon them. There was no drop and no trapdoor for someone to fall directly through. The rope would be secured through the loop on the crossbeam, then the noose was secured around the neck of the inmate who was stood on the bench. They would then have this tightened, and then the bench would be lowered or dropped, and the inmates would slowly strangle to death in front of the huge crowd, kicking and struggling, before they finally went limp after a few minutes. Their bodies would then either be burned in the crematoria or be thrown, more probably, inside of a mass grave, and maybe even cremated in the hole. The prisoners who gave the American generals a tour described what happened on the gallows, and then others gave demonstrations of other torture and execution methods used at Ohrdruf Camp inside different rooms or bunkers. The liberation of Ohrdruf had a huge impact on General Patton, a man who was known for his steely personality. He later said of it, "In a shed was a pile of about 40 completely naked human bodies in the last stages of emaciation. These bodies were lightly sprinkled with lime, not for the purpose of destroying them, but for the purpose of removing the stench. When the shed was full, I presume its capacity to be around 200, the bodies were taken to a pit a mile from the camp, where they were then buried. The inmates claimed that 3,000 men who had either been shot in the head or who had died of starvation had also been buried since the 1st of January. When we began to approach with our troops, the Germans thought it expedient to remove the evidence of their crime. Therefore they had some of the slaves exhume the bodies and place them on a mammoth griddle composed of 60-centimetre railway tracks laid on brick foundation. They poured pitch on the bodies, and they built a fire of pine wood and coal under them. They were not successful in the operation because there was a pile of human bones, skulls, charred torsos on or under the griddle, which must have accounted for many hundred." The gallows and the crimes of Ohrdruf were witnessed by a number of people who brought the evil truth about the Nazi atrocities inside of the concentration camps to the public all around the world. The camp was cleaned up, and the gallows of Ohrdruf told of a camp where many people had suffered, and the structure was used for public executions en masse. The gallows themselves were designed in such a way as to impose suffering and struggle all up until the final moment of death. The Nazis purposely used slow strangulation to make the ordeal rougher, so that the victims of these sites would be in immense pain as long as possible. Execution on the gallows of Ohrdruf was not instant, and those who were inside of the camp told of other horrific ordeals which even appalled the most hardened American generals who had seen terrible things themselves. There were other execution methods deployed at the camp, including firing squad, but the gallows of Ohrdruf were a barbaric structure where many, many people lost their lives upon in front of the view of many more. Thanks for watching. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe, and once again, thank you so much for watching.